to their futures.
Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a monthly program produced by the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109, Veterans for Peace in Olympia, Washington. I am Mark Fleming, your host for this month's program. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and allies whose collective efforts build a culture of peace. As Veterans for Peace, we bring a unique and important voice to issues of war and peace. We inform the public of the true causes and enormous costs of war, and emphasize the nation's obligations to heal the wounds of war. The Rachel Corrie Chapter in Olympia is one of over 140 chapters worldwide whose work includes educating the public, advocating for a dismantling of the war economy, providing services that assist veterans and victims of war, and most significantly, working to end all wars. Each month we present a program focusing on veterans issues, and matters of war and peace. This program examines the conflict between the United States and the Republic of Iran. In early January, Veterans for Peace Governing Board issued a statement condemning the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, a senior Iranian military leader. The statement describes the assassination as the latest unilateral action by the Trump administration that has brought us to the brink of war. The VFP statement further notes that the Trump administration's actions are a blatant violation of both international law and the constitutional mandate that only Congress is granted the power to declare war. Veterans for Peace is sick of the lies and the massacres of innocent people, the waste of our national resources, and the deaths and injuries to our own soldiers. We want peace, not war, with the people of Iran and Iraq. I'm very pleased to have as guests for this timely issue Glenn Anderson and Peter Boehmer. Glenn Anderson is a longtime organizer in Olympia for peace, nonviolence, and social justice, and economic justice, and how to make a better world. He's currently editor of the blog Glenn's Parallax Perspective and host of a Thurston community media program of the same name. His recent writings and programs have examined a wide variety of issues, including alternatives to militaristic policy. Peter Boehmer teaches political economy at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, and has been an activist in movements for social justice and for radical social change since 1967. Peter is passionately committed to an anti-capitalism and development of participatory socialist alternative, and is active in organizing for economic justice and against U.S. militism and war and intervention. So welcome to the program. It's good to have you here.
Thanks, Mark.
And we'll be talking about Iran and our current relations. I'd like to start off just a little bit with some history of Iran. Actually, as we prepared for this program, I went back to say, well, I know about modern Iran, but what about, how did we get here? So I went back and looked at it. It's like in the 19th century, Iran was basically not colonized, but dominated by Britain and Russia, seeking their resources, had concessions, and that made many Iranians objected to that, but were powerless to do much about it. During the early 20th century, there was a revolution that resisted these encroachments, and they even forced the Shah to create a constitutional monarchy. That didn't last very long. It was suppressed, but you had this churning going on. This is about the time of the first Russian Revolution in 1905, during World War I, and after World War I, there was still an effort to create this a democratic government, or at least a constitutional monarchy. And what happened was one of the military officers, Reza Pahlavi, overthrew the existing Shah and was named Shah himself and created the Pahlavi dynasty. And that was the dynasty that was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was the most recent Shah, who was overthrown in 1979. And I bring all this up to point out that Iran has a very strong history of nationalism. They've also been encroached on by other imperial powers. So what we're seeing now really is somewhat of a carry forward. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about U.S. history, U.S. and Iran relations. We didn't seem to have a lot of relations with Iran much before World War II, but afterwards, what happened? So let me start with you, Glenn.
Well, You want to talk about the 1953?
Yeah.
So, as you said, they had this previous Shah, and then his son became the Shah, basically a dictator, and he was he was overthrown by. Excuse me. They had they had briefly a democracy where the people had elected Mossadegh, and Mossadegh was good for the people of Iran and trying to make sure that the oil revenues actually got back to the people of Iran instead of being siphoned off and sent to Britain. And the Shah that we know was imposed by the United States and Britain in the 1953 coup, and where Britain and the U.S. overthrew their democracy, Mossadegh, and in order to make sure that the money kept flowing to Britain. And the oil company is the same one that we know now as British Petroleum, BP, the same company that ruined the Gulf of Mexico. And the U.S. And Britain have, and especially the U.S., has been just dominating that area since then. And there may be more that you could add.
Well, just maybe two things. So Mossadegh, who Glenn mentioned, elected president of the country, and he had this strange idea that the oil of Iran belonged to the Iranian people, not to British Petroleum. There was also increasing U.S. involvement there, and he actually nationalized some of the BP and some of the other companies there. And then Eisenhower was president, was also a great interventionist, and the CIA of both Britain and the United States organized a coup. And again, this isn't some kind of leftist exaggeration. I mean, Eisenhower and Kermit Roosevelt, who led the coup, they later took credit for this coup also. And just maybe adding one more thing, Mark, and I want to thank you also for inviting me and organizing the show. I mean, to show Iran's long history, the Shah, who was overthrown in 79, I believe it was 77, he organized incredibly luxurious, spent hundreds of millions of dollars for this 2,500 years of the Shah's in power. But it does show the long history of Iran, a country that has a long history, very, very strong culture too. Yeah. And the amount of money spent in that really contributed to the growing movements against the Shah. I mean, they go back to the 50s, but they really grow in the 70s. And Iran, I would argue, in this period of the 50s, 53, like Len mentioned, through 79, I would call it a sub-imperialist power. Iran and Israel played the role of kind of controlling the other countries, like in Oman and other places where Iran sent troops, very much kind of doing the U.S.'s bidding in that area.
Yeah, and that was actually the Kissinger doctrine. The United States had already lost the war in Vietnam, which was horribly unpopular because we had to send troops, you and a bunch of other people, my brother, there, and that the war in Vietnam was so unpopular with the American people that Nixon and Kissinger came up with the Kissinger doctrine that says, look, instead of us putting boots on the ground in all these places, let's appoint some regional tough guys, and the Shah of Iran was one of our regional tough guys. Israel is another one, and so the United States was arming Iran, this dictator, with the most sophisticated weaponry that the United States had, and then he could then trample all over everybody on behalf of the U.S. And so he was basically a puppet while serving his own personal interests. And the U.S. arming of Iran was so out of control during that time that the United States Senate Armed Services Committee investigated what was going on there. And the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee is not a left-wing peacenik group at all, but their report said that the U.S. weapons program for Iran was out of control. And for them to say it's out of control, that it really was out of control.
It had to be something unusual.
Yeah, I mean, this was, whoa, and it was that extreme, really. And so when the people of Iran finally rose up and overthrew their government, it was actually a nonviolent revolution. And the people were out in the streets in Tehran and other places, and the Iranian military was sweeping down through the streets of Tehran with U.S.-made Bell helicopters, and the people of Iran knew those were the U.S.-made helicopters that was oppressing them and killing them. So they're not going to be looking kindly at the U.S. government, although they do and always have distinguished between the government versus the American people, as have people in Nicaragua and other places that we've abused.
So I'd like to add one more thing on this, come back to what Glenn said. Well, first, when you say it was nonviolent, you're talking about the protest. The government was incredible.
Oh, the government was, yeah, but I'm saying the revolution was.
I was
yes.
teasing a little bit.
Yeah,
But,
no, exactly.
I mean, one of the things is something I've thought about a lot is if there's repression, does it destroy movements, does it build them? And with Iran, particularly in 77, 78, as the protests grew, it was so inspiring to me. The Iranian military, often with U.S. military's weapons, some of the protests killed over 1,000 people in one demonstration.
Yeah.
The next day, the protests would be bigger. And the
Yeah.
protests grew so much. So I think at certain times when people are so against kind of repressive government, repression no longer works. Because the number of people killed was in the tens of thousands during the protests, and it still grew. A second point I want to make, because I've worked a lot with particularly Iranian students in the United States. There was a really, really strong Iranian Students Association in the United States in the 70s, and I worked very closely with them. And I think many people in the United States, maybe have a kind of a one-dimensional view of Iranians. I think it's an incredibly rich culture. I learned so much from many of the Iranian students. So I think when we talk about Iran, it's not just enough to say we're against the U.S. going to war. I think really we can learn a lot from Iranian people. Iran has some of the most interesting, maybe best films made in the world. So I think it's seeing Iran as a place we can learn from Iranian people, not just seeing them as people either good or bad. So often they're seen as bad in the U.S.
And of course, one of the ways we go to war with people is we say that these people are subhuman, they're different, they're the other, so we can attack them.
Yeah. I want to build on what Peter has said about their rich history. This is Persia.
Right, exactly.
It goes back thousands of years, and Persia has this incredibly rich history of all kinds of the arts and things. One of the most popular poets of books published in the U.S. now is Rumi, who is from the 1200s there, and the people, even teenagers, know and love the poets from way long ago in the history. Kids in the U.S. do not have Walt Whitman memorized or Robert Frost or anybody, but teenagers in Iran have memorized the works of poets from the 1800s. I mean, this is a rich culture, and the filmmaking, right? Yeah, it's amazing. And so the people had that kind of self-confidence of who they were, that they could come back after this violent repression and have bigger turnouts at those rallies and demonstrations, as Peter said.
And as repression increases and as people's immiseration increases, they just become more and more willing to stand up to that.
Yeah. And during that time, Amnesty International said that out of all the world's governments, the government of Iran had the very worst human rights record.
This is under the Shah.
Under the Shah. And so, the United States likes to badmouth China and Russia or Soviet Union and other places, Cuba and whatever else. But Amnesty International, which actually has a good reputation for impartiality, said that under the Shah, Iran had the world's worst human rights. And their secret police, the Savak, was just extremely brutal and cruel and murderous and repressive. So, I mean, this is the context. And the people of Iran knew better than that. They knew that they should not submit themselves to that kind of repression. And they've risen up over the years repeatedly.
And of course, some of the, one of the root causes for some of that repression was the corruption. Under the Shah, there was a lot of corruption, there was wasteful spending, so those resources that were supposedly being held for the Iranian people were not going to them. And the modernization program really didn't get out to the countryside. So it didn't really build a support for it.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned that 2,500 year celebration.
Yeah.
On the other hand, so in the cities of Iran, and certainly the Iranian student movement around the world, there was really very strong views about economic justice, socialism, democracy, women's rights. However, there were also many more conservative forces against the Shah, and so it ended up, the forces around Khomeini were kind of very fundamentalist. Islamic ended up taking the power, even though there had been so many groups. Many of the groups who had challenged the Shah were then repressed by the Khomeini government. So I don't think we want to romanticize the governments in Iran over the last 40 years either. I think our point is to really look at Iranian people as three-dimensional. So often the countries that the United States are at war with or see as the enemy, people are seen as just like cardboard figures. And I would argue, maybe we'll get this later, that the United States actually is waging a war, not a hot war against Iran, but a war too. So maybe we'll get to that too.
I call it the shadow war.
Shadow, I like that.
Yeah, yes.
And we talk about the 53 coup as being a seminal event, and then the 79 revolution. But in the 40 years since, we have been at odds with Iran. Although sometimes we've helped them out. Peter, you mentioned the Iran arms sale.
Right, the Iran
So
Contra.
we use them, for convenience. But it seems like we've had continuous interventions in Iran, going back to the 50s.
Yeah, and during the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq were fighting each other in this long, brutal, murderous war, the United States was helping both sides to kill the other. I mean, so the United States was playing both sides, and so we have a long history of promoting violence in Iraq and in Iran, and against each other as well.
And again, that would feed this idea that Iranians who see themselves as being exploited by outside powers, going back into their history, but still continuing into the present. So we have kind of a checkered relationship. Obviously, we don't have diplomatic relationships, and most recently we are at some level of war. I mean, but I guess one of the questions I have is so what policy and ideological differences drive us? I mean, obviously the oil's got us, but that was more economic. But
well, I see so many of these international issues as coming from U.S. Exceptionalism, U.S. entitlement. Our country, and certainly our politicians and our media, like to see ourselves as we are the great beacon of liberty, we're the shining light on the world, and we are so much blessed by God that we are entitled to dominate the rest of the world. And if some country does something that we don't like, we have the right to go in and overthrow their government or to arm a faction that will attack them or whatever. But we see ourselves, the political self-image our nation has, sees itself as really above and driving history and reality, and it's arrogance. It's what the Greek writers of the Greek tragedies in ancient times called hubris. It's this arrogance that leads to your downfall. And the United States empire really is crashing all around us. And Trump has really brought that even more into a sharp focus of just how horribly corrupt and wrong and immoral and full of hubris the U.S. foreign policy is.
And it's not just Trump. I mean, Trump, you say Trump is bringing...
It's a bipartisan. We've had a long time bipartisan foreign policy, but Trump is just making it so blatant.
So I would argue in some places where the United States has intervened, whether it's CIA, militarily, is they're really afraid of an alternative that could meet people's needs, and that example is spreading.
Yes.
They're not afraid of
Yes.
countries invading, for example, some of the U.S. wars in Central America in the 1980s, I think were very much tied to that, or even a lot of the threats around Cuba, that Cuba was somewhat of an alternative in terms of not being a perfect society, but in terms of meeting healthcare needs, ending homelessness, education, and so on. I think with Iran, we can say it's a desirable alternative. it's also, like the United States, a capitalist economy based on production for profit. Like I said, very, very repressive regime also. So to me, it's not a case there of that alternative being why the United States is trying to clearly overthrow the Iranian society. I think more, particularly in the Middle East, in the Caribbean and the Americas, even more than other places, the idea of countries that try to be independent of U.S. power, economically, politically, military, are seen as a threat. I mean, they're clearly not a threat to us. I mean, if Iran, for example, attacked the United States, they'd be destroyed. I mean, it's a more powerful country than Iraq, but it's not a very powerful country. So to me, that, since World War II, the United States has tried to basically control the Middle East, partly for oil. It goes back to the Truman Doctrine, of the late 1940s, but certainly continued. Carter, who was a Democrat, very much ideas saying.
Yeah, the Carter Doctrine
of course,
said that
we
explicitly.
have the right to intervene, and I think the issue of oil and fossil fuels, even though the United States is producing more than the past, but still is a very, very important factor. So trying to prevent any kind of independent development, deciding where to sell the oil, trying to use other currencies. I think Iran, I said, even though to me they need kind of transformative change the same way the United States does, but again, I think our behavior toward them, given our power, is unconscionable.
Yeah. Well, the currency thing you mentioned, I think people need to realize that for decades now, the U.S. dollar has been the currency in which oil sales are made worldwide, and people who have tried to challenge that, the United States has overthrown them. That was one of the things that Saddam Hussein did. That's one of the things that Hugo Chavez in Venezuela did.
Gaddafi.
And Gaddafi is another one. So there are 3 cases where somebody in an oil-producing country says we want to get out from underneath the domination by the dollar as the only currency for making oil deals, and we go overthrow them.
Yeah, and then I would just add, and I was talking with Mark, and we were talking a few weeks ago. So OPEC, right, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Iran's been a major, major part of that, and for the most part, not before '79, but since the Shah was overthrown, and with the current governments, they've historically pushed for trying to control the amount of oil being produced and trying to keep the prices high. And the U.S., together with kind of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, have very much pushed for more oil production, lower prices. So again, I'm just mentioning that as a way of showing again that some difference with Iran from the United States has been enough to see it as an enemy, even though it's certainly nothing to do with Iran not being democratic. It certainly isn't. But if you look at countries the United States supports, like Saudi Arabia, like United Arab Emirates, like Israel, they're certainly not democratic either. So to me, often the United States, when they say they're supporting freedom and democracy, those are just code words, almost 1984-ish, that justify who the U.S. supports and who they call their enemy.
Is it more of just an economic competition, like the United States is seeking its economic advantage for itself and its allies, and whereas Iran is trying to maximize its profits?
But it's also, I think it's also geopolitical. We have in this country, the government and the media and a large part of the American people feel an entitlement to dominate everybody else.
Yeah, but I would add, so this is one of my things I just hope to share with people when we talk about U.S. interests. To me, the term U.S. national interest, it's again a term trying to get people to support these militaristic, horrible policies. Really hard for people in the United States attacking, but also for people here. I don't think, Mark or Glenn, that you have the same interests as Bloomberg or Trump or Jeff Bezos. But this term national interest, we're all supposed to get behind. When I feel my interests are so much closer with the Iranian people, the Chinese people, than they are with the people who run this country. They're supposed to, wave the flag on the 4th of July, but I think we need to think horizontally and really question this term of U.S. interest. Whose interests?
Yes, exactly.
Because it does, seem like there are wide diversion
Yeah.
within the various
Yeah.
populations.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I do think it's economic, political, but I do think the economic issue is an issue. But again, it's up to the Iranian people to decide. Like I've said many times, there are really important movements there, like major protests that were huge before Soleimani, which you mentioned, who was assassinated in January. And so there are important movements in Iran, I think we should be supporting.
Right. In fact, the Soleimani assassination kind of disrupted that,
Right.
because there were these protests, but all of a sudden, suddenly the Iranian nationalism kicked in because
Right.
they were being attacked. And it's a
Right.
pretty clear example of what happens when
Yeah.
you attack another country.
Yeah, so once some nation is attacked by an outside nation, the people all come together, rally around their government. So what Trump did by assassinating Soleimani was he actually strengthened the hand of the Iranian government hardliners, and he diminished the political power of the dissidents and the positive reformers. So it's one more case in which military violence backfires.
And I am still really worried about a hot war starting with Iran. I just feel, I'm happy that Bolton is no longer, now security advisor. I mean, he's been pushing for war. So have a lot of the neoconservatives going back at least 20 years, probably more like 40. But, reading some of the Project for New American Century, Iran has always been seen as a major target. And I think I was going to say before that I got a little sidetracked, that you all mentioned the feeling of nationalism in Iran. So even though there's a lot of dissatisfaction around economically, there are a lot of problems, some caused by the sanctions, which we may get to, but also caused by, corruption, again, a very capitalist economy. But on the other hand, so there is a lot of dissatisfaction, but there also is this nationalist feeling of like, we don't want the United States to come in, given its history. I mean, some people there do support the United States, like some of the Iranians in the United States do, but I think it's a very, very small part of the population.
And they're the ones that have fled the revolution.
Right.
And may have been supporters of the Shah.
Definitely, a lot of them have. Like, still, I know I was recently at a demonstration in LA that basically called, let me remember the demands, I thought, so this was in January, it was called End to Sanctions, which we hope we get to, no U.S. war against Iran, U.S. troops out of the Middle East, which I support, but also supporting the movements on the ground there against the government. Those were the four demands. But then I know there were some people around us in West LA who were like royalists who actually, they weren't part of the protest, but they said they wanted the Shah or the descendants to be restored. So there is still that kind of royalist feeling, but I think it's a very, very small part of the population.
The Pahlavi dynasty does have an heir in waiting.
Exactly.
So, and actually, talked about sanctions. You've mentioned it before. Like that's actually an act of war.
Yeah, it is, and the American people jump to some solution, quote solution unquote, that does not involve U.S. boots in the ground. So a drone war, oh, that's fine. We don't care how many people we kill as long as no American boots are on the ground. And the economic sanctions is the same thing, but it's brutal, and people in Iran or other nations that have suffered from sanctions, our economic sanctions, die because they can't get medicine, die because the United States has destroyed the infrastructure. When the United States destroyed Iraq in 2003, George W. Bush's war, the United States prevented them from even rebuilding the U.S. military deliberately targeted their sewage system and their clean water system and so forth, so that people could not have clean water. They could not deal with sewage, and sewage was running the street. Now, sewage in your street is a serious public health problem, and it's biological stuff happening in the sewage that makes people sick and kills people. So the United States was actually conducting biological warfare against Iraq for a number of years and prevented them from rebuilding their sewage systems, their clean water systems, their electric systems, prevented them from even importing glass to put in the windows of hospitals. So here you are with a hospital where somebody is suffering, and you got flies coming in and out, and all kinds of stuff. The United States deliberately did things that killed enormous numbers of kids, old people, people of all ages. And those economic sanctions against Iraq were extremely brutal. They really are an act of war.
Yeah.
And the United States government says, "Oh, this is fine," blah blah blah.
But Glenn, I think you're talking about the 90s, not that it was. I mean, it's interesting. It was the sanctions were the worst ones were in the 90s under Clinton. So it's interesting.
That's right.
I think we, again, we're not saying good Democrats, bad Republicans.
Right.
I think, for example, a lot of the sanctions were under.
That's right.
Clinton.
That's right. Yeah, it was. Yeah, Clinton after the older George Bush
Exactly.
war, and then Clinton maintained those sanctions for 8 years, and then George W. Bush. You're right. Thank you for correcting that. George W. Bush started yet another war.
And these are broad-based sanctions,
Yeah,
as opposed to, say, sanctioning an individual.
Yeah, or saying we won't let you import military weapons.
Right, I would support that. I would support that.
Yeah, I mean nobody should be importing military weapons. But yeah, you're right. This was.
In fact, if we had
Clinton was really bad, and 8 years of a Democrat after the older George Bush.
Right.
Yeah.
And then before the younger George Bush made things worse.
And that's
yeah.
something we really need to emphasize is that this kind of policy is just baked into the American political
Right,
system.
yeah. And so even though people are upset with Trump now for very good reasons, this goes way, 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 way back.
It's more open and egregious under Trump, but it's still there.
Yeah.
It was still there, and it's still very debilitating.
Yeah,
In fact,
yeah.
so our economic sanctions are the equivalent of what used to be a naval blockade, which was a known act of war.
Yes,
But
yes. It's
economic
regarded as
sanctions
such.
they got to pass.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because Glenn mentioned earlier the Vietnam War, and when you were talking a few minutes ago, and it does seem that the people who've run U.S. foreign policy, run the government, they didn't learn from Vietnam that this war is immoral. The United States doesn't have a right to intervene. The lesson was, to many of the people, is what they called defeating the Vietnam syndrome, was that the United States can go to war as long as U.S. casualties are kept minimally. And you mentioned the drones, the sanctions, which both of you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think is in a way of trying to overthrow governments by kind of making the people scream. And, you mentioned Iran, but it's also, against Venezuela.
Yes.
The sanctions have been used
We've
a lot.
been doing this
Cuba.
to Cuba since 1959.
Right.
Jeez.
So I think it's not a new policy, and I think again we need very much to oppose the sanction as one part of thinking about solutions.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, let's say, something like arms embargoes,
Yeah.
that sort of. There are some things that are very appropriate for that
Right.
sort of sanction, but against
Definitely.
medicine, going to wreck the economy is definitely goes after the people.
Yeah, yeah.
And then actually, Glenn, you had also mentioned just the interest of the military-industrial complex. You want to talk about that a bit?
Well, when George W. Bush did his No Child Left Behind law, the idea was schools need to meet certain standards of having kids pass these tests, or else we're going to cut your funding for your schools, right? So the idea was, if you don't achieve your goals, we're going to cut your funding. What happens when the military, the last war that we declared was World War II, and the last war that we declared, we did have a victory over Panama in the older George Bush's regime.
But long ago.
But that's been a long time, and the United States keeps losing. So what we do then is we increase the funding for the Pentagon. So it's the opposite of George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind, because what the U.S. military does is they keep doing things that make problems worse. So we go in someplace and people don't want what we're doing, and so they'll shoot at us. So they promised that with W's 2003 war, they would treat us as liberators. No, they're attacking us. And so what we did then is we had this brutal occupation there Afghanistan is one of the poorest nations on earth, and we've not been able to defeat whatever it is that we're trying to defeat for, since way back when.
18 years now.
And instead what we do is we keep throwing more money at the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is rewarded for losing because when the U.S. goes someplace and it causes terrorism to spread into other countries, which is what we've been doing, is we've been spreading terrorism. So now we have all these wars and terrorist groups and ISIS and this and that and whatever else, and Obama escalated U.S. militarism into different countries of Africa, fighting the war on terrorism there, and all this stuff. And the more they lose, the more they fail to achieve military victories, the more money they get.
Okay.
So this serves the Pentagon because they increase their budget, which means they increase their political power, and all the politicians can say, oh, I've got jobs now in my district making hand grenades, bullets,
bombs,
battleships,
airplanes,
whatever.
the whole works.
Yeah, it's very much entrenched, and it's a drain on the economy, and incredibly stupid.
Okay, I guess I would maybe approach it slightly differently. To me, and I think you might agree with it, just what you were saying.
I'm sure
okay.
I will.
Okay, so to me, the question about the U.S. winning or losing a war is totally the wrong question.
Yes.
And, so if the United States, quote, wins, I don't know what that means, but quote, wins, is that a good thing? I don't think it is. Maybe the United States winning Grenada, but is that good for the people of Grenada? So to me, the question is, does the United States have the right to intervene militarily in other countries? And I would say it's maybe not an absolutely no, but I think the criterion to justify the intervention have to be so great. I think the default should be against U.S. intervention.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's, the question. I mean, quote, if the United States had won Vietnam, would that have been a good thing? I don't think so. And so I just think we have to really question the right of the U.S. to intervene in other countries. And that is so absent from most of the political debate. It's often like the killing of Soleimani. I was mentioning to Glenn before we started, watching the debate on Friday, the New Hampshire one. And to most of the people, it was all seen as tactic. Like Biden said, he thought it wasn't good because tactically maybe it was a mistake, but the right of the United States to just kill somebody from another country, as far as I remember, Sanders was the only one who said the United States has no right to do that. So to me, the question is really you have to start with it, saying that the power of the kind of military-industrial complex is immense. Besides the $700 billion officially, it doesn't include a lot of the interest on the debt, the VA stuff, and so on, too. It's really major. And what's sad, again, I don't want to harp just on the Democratic Party. In general, this kind of support for the military, not question the United States to send troops. I don't know how many countries you may know the United States has military bases in. It's over 100. And so to me, the right of that isn't in question. Sanders, while I think being very imperfect, he does seem to have broken away from this kind of Republican Democratic Party consensus on the United States has the right to spend more on the military than the next 10 countries put together.
Well, might be why they're afraid of him.
Exactly. I mean, he's other people kind of tinker around the edges, and he'll get out there and say, "Look, this part of our economy is screwed up. We need to fix that. This part of our foreign policy is screwed up. We need to fix that." And he's out there doing that. But I want to add to what you said about the justifications for intervening. Often. In some recent years, the United States government has said, oh, we need to intervene in this country because they've got some humanitarian problem and we've got a humanitarian intervention, right? So we got to go there and have the military go out and straighten out Yugoslavia or whatever. The United States has horrible racial injustice, a horribly racist criminal justice system, all kinds of stuff. Why doesn't Nigeria have a right to come in and invade the United States and says, look, you guys are just screwing up real bad on racial issues. We are Nigeria. We're going to come in here and we're going to invade the United States and make you guys start treating black people right. Or we like to sell computer stuff to China. Why can't China have a military base in Redmond or Bellevue and say we need to protect our Chinese vital national interests by making sure we have a military base next to the source of our computer stuff? The United States does this all the time with other countries that have resources that we want.
And there's the exceptionalism.
Yeah, so we would never dream of allowing that.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing to what he said, because this is really striking and connected. I was very active in the 1980s in the movement against apartheid, the kind of total segregationist system the South African government had and businesses against the black African people there. And there was a big movement in the United States to try to cut off U.S. loans to South Africa and also U.S. loans and also trade. And I remember Reagan, who was president at the time, there was a bill passed and he vetoed it, even though it got overturned.
Yes.
And he said, it would hurt the black people of South Africa. While at the same time, following what Glenn was saying, looking at the kind of racist policies, that he started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi when he ran, where 3 civil rights workers had been killed in 64. So I think this double standard is really important.
Yes.
And yes, humanitarian intervention is always used for protecting our citizens. That's what Nazi Germany used when they went into Czechoslovakia too in 1938. So I think one is what's said, and secondly, is what's the real intent of what's going on.
Well, actually, I want to move on to one other topic here, which is, now we've talked about this, how do we de-escalate this conflict? And Glenn, you've written a piece about just foreign policy.
I'll just hit some main points. We've been talking about the status quo, kind of this long history of how things are, and the American people tend to think, well, that's just the way things are. That's just the way things are. We need to shine light on it, just like what you're doing on this interview here, is shine light on this, and we can do better than settling for just the way things are. Violence and war have become so normalized that we're trapped in this, and we need to agree with the World Social Forum that has affirmed another world is possible. Let's break this mold and go on into something else. So I want to mention just briefly 6 dominant assumptions that have been driving U.S. foreign policy, and in each case we need to do the opposite of what these assumptions have been. And so one is an inherent polarization. It's like, it's us versus them, and us, number 1, has to be over everybody else who's number 2 and all the way down to below that. And we have to reject the polarization about us versus them, recognize all people are one human family. And so we need to get along with other nations instead of fighting and trying to oppress. And so the second assumption then is that we are not entitled to bully other nations. No nation should bully any other nation. That's why we want to have the United Nations as an entity. But the United States keeps trying to stifle or hurt the United Nations. But the notion of American exceptionalism causes people to think that we're exempt from international law. And we need to recognize that other nations' people, their population, not their elites or their businesses or their whatever, have the right to determine what to do with the natural resources of those nations. And during the Vietnam War, U.S. Senator William Fulbright denounced what he called the arrogance of power, and that really has been infecting the United States for a long, long time, going back to Spanish-American War, certainly, or even before that, the Monroe Doctrine, that says we have exclusive right to dominate Latin America and Europe has to keep the hell out. And so it's that assumption that might makes right and we can do the military domination. That's just wrong. The third assumption is that violence does not solve problems, it just makes problems worse. At the end of a movie, you get the car chase or the shootout or whatever it is, and the good guys kill the bad guys, and that sets things right. And that's been referred to as the myth of redemptive violence. But real life is not like that. Violence does not solve problems, it makes problems worse, and we get blowback. And since the 1950s, the CIA has recognized blowback, countries wanting, or populations wanting to attack us, is caused by what the U.S. has been doing to them. And somebody who appreciates the concept of karma will realize that the U.S. is doing bad karma, and it comes back at us. So we have to get away from violence as the problem itself and have nonviolent and just and fair methods. Fourth point is really everything is interconnected, and so this relates to the blowback and the bad karma. 5 is instead of assuming that the world and the problems are a zero-sum game where we can't let another country do well because that'll mean less for us, we need to recognize that we're all in this together, so let's create win-win situations. Let's have real diplomacy. Let's work together and find ways that we can all do well. And finally, the 6th thing is to get out of this national security narrowness that looks at the United States being secure at everybody else's expense and realize that we would be more secure as a nation if we helped other nations be secure too. If we look for the well-being of everybody, then that rising tide will lift all boats and help us too. So nationalism and militarism are really false idols, and we need to get away from all of that.
So I'm going to add two terms briefly that Glenn used to fund, and then we'll talk about the treaty about the nuclear weapons that was pushed through by Obama and
the JCPOA.
Yeah. So the term blowback, which you mentioned, so one of the reasons people often use for hostility toward Iran is the capturing of the people at the U.S. embassy, right? The hostages in 79, 80, 81. And again, I'm not justified. I don't think that was right. But part of the context was that it was a major criminal, the Shah, who had, like you mentioned, as repressive as any government in the world, he was given, basically sanctuary in the United States. And that was the immediate event, again, the history of U.S. role there. So again, it's not justifying, but looking at it as context. The issue of U.S. exceptionalism, and it's often used, so the United States has the right to do things that other countries don't, to somehow wear a beacon for peace. Our motive is always just about peace and freedom, never about any kind of aggression or, basically helping U.S. corporations by taking resources out. And to me, an extreme form of this is the United States has the right to have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world, I don't know how many times over. But if Iran develops any nuclear weapons, they should be destroyed. It's an incredible double standard there. And I don't think any country should have nuclear weapons, but certainly Iran has as much right as anybody else. But certainly I think we need to move to a world, Glenn was referring to, that nobody has nuclear weapons. And even though we've mentioned the Obama administration really was not a force really for justice and peace, that he got the Nobel Peace Prize, to me is so undeserved. But nevertheless, the agreement that Glenn mentioned, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JPOA, to me was a small step forward toward a more peaceful Middle East. And I thought it was a good thing that, and it wasn't just the U.S., I mean, many other countries, Europe,
six other countries.
Six countries. So it seems to me it was a step forward, and there was agreement on a pretty large level, both by governments and people who knew about it. And again, that the Trump administration basically destroying this, I think, is part of the context of what's going on. It's where you start history, and to me, that's so important. We've tried to do some of that tonight. So one thing about de-escalating the conflict, it seems very important that we, when I say we, I mean kind of people, grassroots movement, really make part of our program to restoring this, not just ending the sanctions, which we already talked about, but also restoring this kind of peace treaty of non-weapons thing.
Well, it was a dialogue. I mean, people say, well, it didn't go far enough. Well, the solution to that would be, well, what's missing? What can we add?
Of course.
They built startup level of trust to work with, and now it's just been thrown out. So getting Iran back to the table, well, why would they come back? Because you don't live up to your agreements.
That's what, I mean, and this has been Trump's scam. One of his many scams is he postures as if he's this great deal maker, but all he's been doing is destroying deals, destroying treaty, the intermediate force nuclear, intermediate range nuclear force, nuclear weapons treaty, and the JCPOA with Iran. All these agreements, the climate Paris Climate Agreement,
many others.
And he doesn't produce any good solutions. All he does is destroy things, and these agreements are examples of what we need to do, because the JCPOA, Iran was a party to it. They worked it out, and these other nations, the U.S. and some European nations, Russia, and so it's a win-win all the way around. It solves a problem, and that's what we need to be doing is practice real diplomacy.
And that would be the first step in a confidence building. We could go from there.
Yeah.
Well, we're starting to run out of time. We didn't even get to what Americans can do. But very briefly, I was going to point out that there are bills in Congress now, both in the House and the Senate, to prohibit funding for war in Iran. Bernie Sanders has a bill in the Senate. Ro Khanna has one in the House. And then there's Tim Kaine is looking to create an authorization to use military force that prohibits war with Iran without congressional approval. And Barbara Lee in the House wants to repeal the 2002 authorization. So that's in the work now. It's all been introduced. It really hasn't moved. Denny Heck has been a sponsor or co-sponsor of, come on, I'll find it now. Oh, the prohibiting funding for the military action against Iran, and Maria Cantwell is also supporting the Senate bill.
That's good.
So that's good.
But generally, our U.S. House member and our two senators are AWOL when it comes to things in Congress that will help promote peace. They are just utterly negligent.
Yes.
In most, the vast majority of cases, they are just AWOL.
So what Americans can do and Washingtonians can do is press those members of Congress.
And I would add, I know we're running out of time, just like there was a very, very big movement against the U.S. war in Vietnam that killed maybe 2 million people there, and 55,000 plus U.S. soldiers. It seems we really need an anti-war movement now. And I think the danger of the U.S. going to a hot war with Iran is very, very real. And again, it's not only Trump. I think some of the Democrats also.
Yes.
And so I think building an anti-war movement that's a militant movement that also links it to issues of climate change, economic justice, anti-racism at home. It's much more than just the money. This whole militarism, I think, needs to be really opposed more. I also believe very strongly, like I've mentioned many times, there's really a lot of important movements in Iran against austerity, against dictatorship, for women's rights, against corruption. I don't think the U.S. government should be involved anyway. I think it wouldn't be to support anything positive in those movements. But I think as people here, we need to learn about Iran, not seeing Iran as these stick figures, as these crazy fundamentalists, as really a rich culture, but also work and support movements, try to develop relations with movements there. There's many groups in the United States that are working now. They're small, that really is in solidarity with the Iranian people. And I think we need to see that much more than we have.
All right, well, thank you very much for the time and your comments. It's been very, very informative, and I'd like to thank our viewers for watching and remind you that this is something you can work on and pursue a more diplomatic approach to our relationship with Iran rather than war. So thank you very much.
Soldiers speak out. We can tell the truth.
I have no sound.